All right, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Sarah Audsley, and I'm the Writing Across Media Facilitator at the Vermont Studio Center. So a little bit about our readers, our wonderful poets tonight. I'm going to read all three bios, and then I'll kick it over to Sebastian. Our first reader tonight is Afaa Michael Weaver. He is the author of A Hard Summation, which was published in 2014. And his most recent book of poems is Spirit Boxing. A Guggenheim Fellow, he is Professor Emeritus at Simmons University and in semi-retirement as he teaches at St. Sarah Lawrence still. They just can't get you to stop teaching, Afaa. Our second poet reading for us tonight, all the way over on the West Coast, Gary Copeland Lilley is the author of 8 books of poetry, the most recent being The Bushman's Medicine Show from Lost Horse Press in 2017, and a chapbook, The Hog Killing from Blue Horse Press, 2018. He is originally from North Carolina and now lives in the Pacific Northwest. He has received the Washington, D.C. Commission on the Arts Fellowship for Poetry. He is published in numerous anthologies and journals, and he is a Cave Canem Fellow. And finally, our third poet tonight, who is facilitating and moderating the conversation, Sebastian Matthews, is the author most recently of the memoir, Beyond Repair, Living in a Fractured State, from Red Hen Press, out this year. He serves on the board of trustees at Vermont Studio Center, for which we were very grateful, and he will be moderating tonight. So thank you so much for being here, and Sebastian, please take it away.
Sarah, thank you for having us tonight, and I love what you're doing with this Writer to Writer series. It's an honor to be moderating tonight, and really an honor to be with Gary and Afaa, 2 amazing poets. I think of tonight's event as a set of interlocking conversations between you both, between Gary and Afaa, between me and you as the moderator and interview with the writer, and between the 3 of us in the audience, and most importantly, between your work and your 2 voices. So let's begin there. Gary, you start, and then Afaa, and then I have a couple questions, and we'll see how it goes.
Well, thank you all. I'm glad to be here, especially reading with this legendary poet here. So I feel honored just to be here. Thank you much. I'm going to be reading from Cape Fear. So the section of Cape Fear, and I'm going to read a few poems. The first is Colonel Waddell on the morning of November 10th, 1898. They vote Republican black. They walk our streets with their heads up, with more freedom than a white man. And now we have been made to conduct our city's business under the rule of carpetbaggers and Negroes. White men will suffer eternally if we do not honor that is our blood that makes North Carolina sacred ground. If we don't act, they'll soon have the land and all our grand history that's on it. The Confederate graves, all the gray men from all our families, to their proud deaths give glory. Honor the white way of life. Let black bodies choke the Cape Fear River. Mrs. Rebecca Lattimore Felton's call. Where are the white men? In the past few weeks, have they not heard as I have? The stories that Negro men attack and ravish white women on the farms? And the only impediment to this foul act, it seems, have been the few occasions the Negroes were put to the tree. Where are the brave Southern white men when there is not enough religion in the pulpit to organize a crusade against sin? nor justice in the courthouse to promptly punish crime, nor manhood enough in the nation to put a sheltering arm around virtue and innocence. If it takes lynching to protect a woman's dearest possession from the ravening beast, then I say lynch, if necessary, 1,000 times a week. Alexander Manley's editorial reply in the Daily Record. Poor white men are careless in the matter of protecting their women, especially on the farms. They are careless of their conduct towards them. Our experience among poor white people in the country teaches us that women of that race are not more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with Negro men than the white men with Negro women. Meetings of this kind go on for some time until the woman's infatuation or the man's boldness bring attention to them, and the man is lynched for rape. Every Negro lynched is called a big, burly, black brute. In fact, many of those who have been thus dealt with had white men for their fathers, and were not only not black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them. And this is very well known to all. The Fire, November 10, 1898. The red shirts, 2,000 devils, 12 abreast, marched into the Negro neighborhood, to the corner of 7th Street, to the Love and Charity Hall where the newspaper was printed. Alex Manley was already gone, having been warned that his life was in danger. They set upon the building and lit it up. Flames went through the roof and sparked nearby houses. The Negro fire crew responded to the call and tried to fight the fire until armed white men cursed and shot above their heads. They would not let them near the Daily Record, and the office burned down. A grandmother dropped to her knees in front of the African Methodist Church and called on her God to destroy these white men. Some flames cannot be doused. The Negro children broke from the school screaming and ran through the streets. Fourth and Harnett Street. The Negro workers from the waterfront gathered at George Hayer's store. Smoke from the burning of the record, heavy in their clothes. A streetcar load of red shirts came to the Brooklyn neighborhood, and they disembarked to confront the Negroes. Curses and threats flew from the opposing corners of 4th and Harnett Streets. Mr. Aaron Lockamy, a newly sworn white policeman, under orders to arrest no white man, tried twice to get the Negroes to leave, but they would not. He told the whites that none of the Negroes carried guns, but they didn't care. Officer Lockamy left the scene wearing a cloak of his official inability. One shot and then a volley was directed towards the Negroes. Sam Gregory and John Gregory were killed right there. Sam McFarland, who was on his way home to dinner when got shot, crawled underneath Mrs. Strauss' house on 4th Street and died some hours later. 2 other wounded stumbled into a house on Harnett, and the white men followed. Inside, they found a dead man and another unidentified Negro with grievous wounds. The rest of the Negroes, those that could, escaped down Harnett Street. The Gauntlet. Daniel Wright, a Negro politician and leader and example of Negro dignity, was implicated in the wounding of Mr. William Mayo, who was shot through both lungs in the crossfire directed on the Negroes running down Harnett Street. Even though there was no reliable testimony that the Negro Daniel Wright had been there, the red shirt mob demanding surrender shot into his freshly painted house. It was then that the Negro returned fire, killing Mr. Will Terry and Mr. George Bland before the red shirts captured him. The Negro was hit in the head with a lengthful pipe and made to run the gauntlet. Before he ran 15 steps, he was riddled with bullets and laid there in the street for most of 2 hours before the red shirts allowed some of the Negroes from the church to remove him to the hospital, where he was denied treatment and lingered for a day before he died. The Exodus. As the wreckage burned, the Negro women fled their homes, children in tow to the outskirts of town. There, the few men who escaped the patrollers joined them and made their way towards the marsh. They rested in the cemeteries with their backs against the tombstones or lying stretched along the graves. The mild November day grew chilly, and at dusk the cold mist from the river rolled in. The roads were filled with the refugees carrying their bedding and a few personal belongings, and the children whimpered as they quick marched with their mothers into the darkness of the night, into the bog. Crouching waist deep in the icy waters, a pregnant woman gave birth to her baby, who then died from exposure. It began to rain, and the Negroes continued deeper into the swamp. And I'm going to stop right there.
I'm reading from A Hard Summation, and I'll begin with the first poem in the book, entitled The Kidnappers. A cruel silence in the night. The children's songs pulled under a rustle of leaves, mothers turning away for a second to pick up toys dropped in shadows. As hands cover children's mouths, their heels struggling in soft dirt. Swallowed by forest, birth turned to death. The yard empty, neighbors hushed by wailing from houses where ache lives. A cruel silence in the night. The children's songs gone, mama pulled into the broad arms of papa, dry womb of old sinew and bone, eyes glazed, sons and daughters, hope against old age, swept up by strangers to lie down in the music of deep water. On December 29th in 1840, a ship left Freetown in West Africa, landed in Havana, and on the database at Emory University, it's recorded as voyage number 2071, and of the 200 plus people, the human cargo on board, 98.3% were children. A ship's log. Children who gave us life. A family seed on board the Jesus Maria. Who took you? Sherbro, Mende, Portuguese. Who took your name to your mother's ears to whisper, child gone, womb of your grandchildren gone? Who set you free in Havana? What filled you in the ship of 234, mostly children, half of them boys, half of them girls, 8, 9, 10 years into a language they will forget? What happened to the crew listening to children cry for weeks from Freetown to Havana, Freetown where slaves begin? And did the crisp light of the moon curse sailors who waited to ease below to prowl and touch at night. Children, a ship full of mothers screaming where these could not hear their names being cried out. Girls and boys shivering in the creak of wood in the water, the forward dip and lean of sail to wind, their names being cried out in languages they will barely know if they live to think of what they know. Ribbed womb of ship belly, plank to plank, cog and nail, cupped hands of demons moving in the Atlantic to progress, with children whose names have kept their power. Mamboa, Bunde, Sulu, Goibo, Mafoma, Janu, Boya, Daru, Mahu, Cobre, Mai, Ifa, Dora, Duevo, Makani, Momo, Maneni, Kanundi, Kumba, Quinda, Iakaye, Sese, Belu, Coloma. Sons and daughters, hope against old age, swept up by strangers to lie down in the music of deep water, a baptism and a melody of grief. The children praying to be loved in a world their mothers do not know, in Africa where stars try to make peace with death. White men were able to exploit Black women sexually in the 19th century and into the 20th, very often with impunity. Night Song for Missy. My bones tied up with his bones at night, him falling asleep in my arm after wrestling me, calling it love in some kind of low whisper no dog would believe. I know his every smell, every way the littlest corner of him be stinking underneath me, on top of me, while our children snore in the corner, then he creep out the way he creep in, before the cock crow at the sun. In daylight, he act like we strangers on the edge of the field, his little tan children of mine turning brown, playing more than working because they his children. Missy look over at me while I look over at her. Both of us got some kind of papers on this same man that say he owned both of us. The man who owes us even when he died, cause the Bible say you gotta look after the widow. But when he died, it will be cause Missy and me locked eyes many days and hated him like one wronged woman made out of two. Him standing up there on the porch studying everything, his eyes lit up like he the Lord of all creation. Hush now, night wind on my skin. Hush now, bird lost in trees. Hush now, hungry moon. The last poem in this chapbook, there are 13 poems, pays tribute to Heaven Sutton. She was killed in Chicago by a stray bullet on June 27th, 2012. She was 12 years old. I'm sorry, she was 7 years old. On the passing of Heaven Sutton. In the year the Mayans said our world ends, I sit in my basement apartment, the cave, my neighbors from lives different from mine. It is a most peculiar way to be 60. Up here from down south, no way to know where up is, what up is or should be, only what it used to be. Winters in Boston go inside my bones until I feel the center of nothing, where people grow old, singing Shine on Me in a cappella. It is the center of alien coldness, hearts naked to ice, to a blank sun, a nakedness that says it is the only choice, one that owns love's essence. I am Black because I enter that space. People see I am the door to what they ache to know, the long corridors and rooms of our freedom. a place where I refuse to be told I cannot dream my own dreams, a place where people like me agree to offer love from an uneasy forgiveness. Nights become deep stillness. I do a soul dance with ancestors building a respite from history, arguing against the hard summation of slavery. The truth of our Black wish for humanity, a seed made from resistance, bright moments where we teach America the song of our right to live. Thank you.
Afaa, Gary, thank you so much. Beautiful work, powerful. I also want to thank you for reading from these two chapbooks. Cape Fear came out in 2012. A Hard Summation came out in 2014. I want to ask you guys two questions, and then maybe we can open it up and see what you might have to speak with each other, and maybe what the people here listening might have to ask you. But I thought of these two books together. They're clearly, in my mind, speaking to each other and speaking to this time. Gary, as you know, Cape Fear began as a chapbook that you and I worked on together. It was actually a double chapbook with Holly Iglesias, a good friend of ours, and was honored to work with you on it. Q Avenue Press, a collective for chapbooks and collaborations. And Afaa, if I'm not mistaken, A Hard Summation, I love this cover, was a book you wrote in conjunction with or commissioned by the Kenosha Congress of Poets for Peace. Gary, in your intro to this book, you write, in 2006, I wrote a tiny notice in a prominent national newspaper apologizing for its participation as part of the propaganda wing in a campaign that led to the 1898 massacre of African Americans in Wilmington, North Carolina. I had never heard of it, and you were North Carolina born. This book covers the short span of that massacre through 16 what you call poetic dispatches, documenting this country's only coup d'etat. You write, this collection is my attempt to tell this history of my home as a poet. And Afaa's book, in the words of Enzo Silon Surin, is a suite of 13 poems covering the history of African Americans from the Middle Passage to now, which unearths a genealogical deficit that permeates through generations. In it, you capture, as we've heard, a glimpse of a host of voices across time, drawing as Gary does from historical record and real life incidents. To me, knowing what we've gone through as a country this last year, these two books still seem relevant today, maybe more so than when they were published. Can you both talk a little bit about these projects?
Gary, would you like to go first? You read first, sir. Are you muted, Gary?
Thank you. Yeah, I was up in Provincetown and doing the fine arts workshop there. And my day would be writing in the morning and then going to breakfast or brunch and reading all these newspapers. And so that one day I was reading the New York Times, and the New York Times, you know, and those little tiny little snatches of news that they give their apologies for. Well, they were apologizing for their participation in the Wilmington riot, in the Wilmington massacre of 1898. And I had never heard of it. And I grew up there. I grew up probably about 60, 70 miles from it, and had never heard any of the old people talk about it, and never heard anything of it. The people who led this rebellion, who led the only coup d'etat so far in America, these people so terrorized the African American community that, you know, 100 years later, it was not talked about at all. Not talked about. So it was about getting the research, and then like I felt an obligation that I need to kind of work with this thing. I need to kind of bring this forward. I need to find out what happened and bring it forward and stuff. So that was my that was the catalyst for me writing Cape Fear. You know, just that need.
Well, for me, thank you, Gary. And for me, writing A Hard Summation was done at the request of conservative Republican friends in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They called me in 2012 in the summer and asked the spokesperson, as I call her, my friend Marianne, asked her, she said, well, would you write about African-American history? And their concern was that African-American students, as they knew them, they did work in schools and so on, needed more information about their history and people generally. And so I set out to do this book. And the focus begins with children, and the thread that goes through the 13 poems is mostly about children. And I was trying to connect to a family history that was related to me by my father's eldest sibling, my Aunt Janet, who since passed away. And at that time, and they grew up in Virginia and North Carolina, the oldest children were given history that the youngest children were not. And so she explained that her great-grandmother, which would be my great-great-grandmother, was taken from West Africa when she was about 8 and brought to the US. This was, of course, after it was quote unquote illegal to do so. And so I wanted to verify that children were actually taken around sometime in the mid 1830s. And when I located that ship in the archives, that's how I was able to launch the project. And fast forward to this past summer, in August, a man was shot and he remains paralyzed at this time, Jacob Blake, I believe he's 29 or 30. And of all the incidents that happened this past year, that one upset me the most because he was grabbed in his shirt by the policeman as he was trying to get to his children. And that was really disturbing for me. So I talked to my friends in Wisconsin, and they were concerned as well. And they said, we should really try to talk, you should talk more about this book. And the book is a kind of plea for attention to be paid to the fact that the history keeps repeating itself. And things get, as Gary said, things get put away and forgotten. And so that's how I came to, pull the book out and say I should just begin talking about it again.
Thank you. I'm curious how the response has been, with this book, maybe when they first came out, and like you're talking about, Afaa, kind of now as they resonate in other ways and maybe in deeper ways for some readers. Are you finding that people, I'm curious what kind of response you've received from these chapbooks. And I know chapbooks have sometimes a limited range, but I'm just curious.
Well, I would say the responses that I get have been very positive, but the response that was most important to me was that of my conservative friends. And when I wrote the book, I didn't know how they would respond. They're not extreme right-wing, but they are conservative. And they were very happy with the book and delighted, I would say. But as you say, chapbooks have limited ranges, and the distribution of the book has been hampered by the fact that it is a small press. But I have taken it upon myself to just try to say more and get more of the word out about the book. But I have never had any negative response to the book.
And Gary, this double chapbook, Holly's book's about a lot of the assassinations and bombings going on in Miami back in the day. And so those two books had a kind of resonance with each other. But I'm curious kind of where you're at with this question.
As far as the response, I live in a pretty progressive area right now in Washington State, you know. But like, don't be fooled by that because there is a strong conservative element that is also here. And so, but the first time that I started reading those poems, it was doing open mics and stuff, and it so upset people, even though this was 100 years ago, you know, and they're hearing these poems. I mean, where I live, there is like a very small African American community there. In fact, of the town of 10,000, Fort Townsend, you may have about 20 African Americans at that time. So the progressive people, they liked all the poems that I had been doing, but these shook them up, you know, that they felt like they had been responsible. So, you know, and I think it was because they had never had to deal with the issue of race because there's so few people, there's so few others that that this shook them, that this history shook them. But this was the first mention of white supremacy movement. This is what gave it their name. This coup d'etat, this one, they deposed an elected government of blacks and small farmers simply because they had won. And they wanted to, their aim was to restore the natural order. And this is why they organized the newspapers as a propaganda wing. This is why they organized the militias, you know, as their army. And they organized a speakers bureau of the Confederates, veterans, the officers, those that owned the plantations and stuff. And these people became our governors and our congressmen for North Carolina. And they set the model for everything that happens after that with white supremacy. But like I was saying, but back home, we never heard of it. It was stricken from everything about the education of the state, you know. So how do I want to approach it? I felt like if they used newspapers for their propaganda, then I had to write dispatches as if I'm the newspaper now. Mm. That was my goal in this.
Oh, wow. It's like they kind of, that's one of the big first drum beats of Jim Crow, you know?
Yes.
I think there'll probably be some questions from folks listening, and I'm going to get out of the way in a second. But I wanted to ask you one more question that kind of is a little tangential, but I think it comes around to some of this material. And it pertains, I'm sorry, I'm just going to read this because I want to say it right. It pertains to our relationships as poets and artists and teachers to arts organizations. Of course, I think of the Vermont Studio Center, where Afaa has served as a visiting writer, as have I, and whose board I serve on, but also places such as Cave Canem and the Frost Place and the Warren Wilson MFA, which we were talking about, and Callaloo. Gary, I know you're a proud Cave Canem Fellow, and Afaa was on their faculty and honored as their first elder.
Yeah.
Afaa does amazing work with the Frost Place. You know, Gary and I met at Warren Wilson College, where we both taught undergrad, but he received his MFA, as Sarah has at Warren Wilson's MFA. And then of Callaloo, who published, I didn't know this until recently, Afaa's first book, and who I've worked with to connect to Vermont Studio Center through a series of fellowships. I mean, there are others, of course, but could you say a few words about your relationships with organizations such as these? And I ask this because I've been hearing recently people doubt why we support these organizations in such a monumental time when so many people need food scarcity, and face such devastating injustice and inequity. So what makes them so important? even now?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I was reading a review of a book that's just coming out by a conservative who's making a hard case for liberal education. And I think the hardline stance of some conservatives, or some who would call themselves conservatives, is that arts education generally is just not necessary. But I think I've always believed and still believe that giving an educational framework and providing access for developing poets, I'll be specific, but by extension to all the arts, is essential to these huge problems human society faces right now, because I maintain that a creative mind can think out of the box, right? And I would say that creativity is just as important, if not more so now than it ever has been. And that's why I work with Cave. Well, I'm the first elder of Cave Canem. I support the organization. I work with the Frost Place and Red Hen, Cave Carey Press. But these organizations are vital to the growth of the American creative mind, you know. And I think we have to be very clear that our adversaries are people who don't understand that, or who believe that the corporate culture will solve all the problems that humanity has. I don't believe that. So it comes down to a belief in the creative ability of human beings to give us some input about what is human, about the quality of our lives, to give us space to examine our feelings and to validate those things in art. And so that's what I would say about why these organizations are important. And the money that it takes to sustain them is less than a drop in the bucket of the money that's out there in the corporate culture. It doesn't make sense. You know, I received an NEA in 1985. It was $20,000. It was tax-free. When Reagan came in, he taxed it. Why should I pay taxes on something I pay taxes to have? There's no logic to it, you know? And so I think in clear terms, that's why I do this work and why I think it's important.
Okay. I am a proud fellow from Cave Canem. And I remember when Cave Canem in 96, 97, when it first had a group of poets come together, there was nowhere else for African American poets to be, or to where they could work with each other and have those connections with each other. It didn't exist up until then. And so, and I remember how my friends, I had a lot of friends in DC that were there for that first year and the second year and the third year. You're there for like 3 summers, you know. And so I remember how they all felt when they returned, and just in the camaraderie that they had, the strength that they had gathered in that 1 week. You know, it was amazing. It was amazing. And I'm like, why wasn't I there? You know, I was like that then. These were my peers. These were, you know, and it was 20 years later that I got into Cave Canem. And I will tell you the truth, I felt like I got in there at the right time for me. And stuff. I had nothing to say but just good things about them. I can say that that we learn the power of it, the expression there. everything is under this, like, everything is under this pressure. But this is creative pressure. This is fun pressure here. That you're there and you create this work. And you know what? And you do it all in that week. You don't bring poems to there. You create poems when you're there, every night. And there's something about having to go through to that rigor, that kind of led me into like the way that I researched, and how that had paid off for me, and it's just different things. And I look at all the other writers too that we hear about now and stuff. But why was it important? Because there was nowhere for us to hone our game as like poets. There was nowhere for us to be together. And that's what when I look back on it now, and I look at the accomplishments of the people who have been there, I am truly amazed all the time. I'm amazed by Tahima Jeff. I'm amazed by Terrence Hayes. I'm amazed by Yona Harvey. I'm amazed by all these writers. I'm amazed by everybody I met there. I'm amazed by Jericho Brown. That's what I'm talking about.
And if I could add just one thing to support what you're saying, Gary, is Elizabeth Alexander and I were the first guest poets in the first year in 1996 at Cave Canem, which is very close to, that old site is very close to where my wife and I live now. And in the second year, we were asked to come and help teach. And the emotion in the closing night of ceremony that we had was tremendous. People cried and they wept because they had never had a place where they could talk about their art with people who understood their cultural context and support. It was just an incredible, people wept like I've never seen people cry before, because Black poets had never had a home. They had never had a home, and I taught the people you named. I taught Terrence Hayes. I taught Tahima Jeff. I taught Evie Shockley. I taught Honoré Jeffers. I taught all of them that were there in that first. And I tell them when I see them sometimes now, I said, don't forget, Cornelius and Toy and Elizabeth and I, we didn't have what we gave you.
Right.
We didn't have it, And so it's really important, I think. It is. And as my friend Robert Pinsky and a few others have said, Cave Canem has changed the course of American poetry.
Yeah. And I would add, you got to add Kundiman, and you got to add Contamundo, and all the other organizations that either came up at the same time or took, said, okay, you're doing that, then we can do this. And I also, Callaloo blows me away with how they bring the diaspora into this, they mix it up like a gumbo. I'd love to have you guys keep talking to each other, and or if anybody has any questions they want to throw Sarah's way, or just, I'm not sure how we should do it, but maybe first, if you have any questions for each other, I'll just step out of the way, and we got about 15 minutes. We can do both. You guys talk to each other and maybe have some people ask some questions.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, Gary, I don't know if you thought about this, but this past summer with all of the, what some people call social unrest, others would say progressive action, and how it became violent at times, quite often. I did just a little bit of reading, and back to the summer of 1919, it was the red hot summer. And that red hot summer followed the flu epidemic of 1917. And when 1918, the spring came around, it segued right into that summer, all of that pent up frustration. And I didn't see too much discussion of that last spring, but I would say that I think people should be aware of that this time, because we're going into spring again. We're going to come out of it late spring, and a really, in an economy that's really unchallenged. And history does tend to repeat itself. I have some concerns. Let me just say that I have some concerns about that.
Yeah. Well, I was struck by when you were doing your poems. One, I was in the Navy in Charleston. So the slave market. I mean, you were hitting things that were like conjuring up all these recollections from me about being there, and that market itself is underneath of what it has become a Confederate museum there, and they sell, now you can buy all these artifacts, these things there, but they just call it the market. But everybody, African American people, know it as what it really is. It is the slave market, still. And so, but I'm hearing these names of places that you were given, and these things are just seem to have grown there and flourished there because they're still here now with our time, And so, what do you, to not be frustrated, how do we move here? How do we move? And so, when we see things happening over and over, when we see a different dimension of the same game all the time, and so, like I remember when everybody came back from Cave Canem, and they, you're one of the names that was on everybody's mind, everybody's heart and stuff, for the way that you respond to the poets and stuff. So I appreciate that, and I look at how we come up and stuff. I know that you had a working class background, and from Baltimore, that you worked in factories and stuff. I worked in a factory in North Carolina. When I was young, I was in my 20s. In Baltimore, when I moved to DC after the military, Baltimore is not that far from DC. In fact, it's about 40 miles or so. And I did a lot of stuff back and forth to Baltimore to DC and stuff. And every time I go to Baltimore, the people in Baltimore would see my DC tag and say, "You're a long way from home, aren't you, bro?" And I'm like, "Oh no, I'm just a country boy. Oh no, it's only 45 miles." With big grin, big smile, and to disarm them because hey, this is still my hood. This is still my people. This is we got no problems. This is what I was trying to get across and stuff. So I look at the similarities, how we came up and stuff, and I feel comforted by knowing that you come up the same way, and that nothing is given, everything is gained.
That's true, Gary. That's true, and we carry our history in our DNA. We carry the trauma of the struggle, in our DNA. And so when you come across these stories like the one about Wilmington, when I was in Charleston in the summer of 1996, before that place was built, I haven't been there since. I went to the old slave mart, and it was closed that day. It wasn't open for viewing. And I stood on my tiptoe and looked up at the window, and I could see the hooks on the wall. And on those hooks, during the time of slave auctions, Black people were stripped naked and their hands were tied. So they were hung on the hooks so that they could be examined like livestock, so people could make determinations about whether or not to bid on them. And I got sick in my stomach, and I had to go down and walk on the other side of the street. It was so disturbing, and but we carry it in our bodies, we carry it in ways that we may not even be aware of, how we get triggered by these things. When I see a policeman, you know, my wife and I, the car broke down a few months back. The starter went up on it, and we had to call a policeman. And I always put my things out on the dashboard whenever I leave the house so I can just get them. And it was broad daylight, and there were people around, but that doesn't matter. And he came up on my left side, and he stood far enough back where he wouldn't be in the traffic, but he could also draw his weapon and shoot. And I knew that. But he also was not wearing a mask. He was defiant of the mask. He wasn't wearing a mask. Right. And so, but I've been through this enough not to be afraid. It was more annoying than anything else. But I just said, oh, he said, well, how are you? How's your day going? And I sort of smiled. I said, well, it could be better. And from that point on, he was like he just, you know, he came off of his stance, you know, but I was fully aware of the position, you know, and, but those things shouldn't have to be, you know, and the great irony in this country is that I was listening today on NPR, a woman who has published a book about white male culture in America, and she was talking about statistics. I think the book is called Mediocre, but how the country is gauged according to the success of white men. And she said, in the national suicide rates in this country, most of them, more than half, are white men. And there is this discontent, this feeling that they've lost access to what belongs to them, you know. And I have seen that as well. So you ask what has to be done. I don't know what it will take for all Americans to realize that all of our lives are at stake by the way that this country lives, you know. The productivity. I worked in factories. I worked for one of the largest corporations in the world, Procter & Gamble. And it can't go on like this, you know? It cannot go on like this. But when you say that to some people, you get this instant, like, the resistance to that. What do you mean it can't go on like this? There's a limit to how far you can push, you know, the world, when the world pushes back, you know. So I think we are sort of the canary in the mine, you know, and, you know, the mine being the whole structure of the thing. And people had better pay attention to the canary, you know, because if they think their lives are not connected to ours as Black people, then we're all in deep danger, you know, deep danger. And we have to realize that. So Black Lives Matter. Yes, all lives matter, but if you don't pay attention to Black Lives Matter, if you ignore the issues related to that, then you're ignoring the fact that the house is on fire, you know? And I'm saying that in a way that as a poet, I understand it. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a poet. But that's how I understand it, you know? And so, but you ask what can be done.
Right.
What has to be done.
What has to be done.
Yeah.
Listen, we're coming down to it. I wondered if it's okay, if you don't mind, if you might each want to read something, one short poem that's relatively new. I kind of asked you to read something a little way back, but do you guys have something you might want to read as a way to finish this up?
Gary, do you have something, or you?
I'm gonna read a poem from the Bushman's Medicine Show.
Okay.
I'm gonna read the first poem in the book. Standing on the corner when being cool went blind. You've been slipping in the darkness, whoa, 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 and pretty soon you're gonna pay. War. Yeah, baby, I'm the Bushman. Everybody know me, a talking drum. I am the oral tradition, the griot of the cigarette. No bullshit. Ain't nothing but the truth. Everything I tell you is airtight and waterproof. I can hoodoo in close view this neighborhood's future from the vantage of my stoop. Get down like I'm proud. I like mud cloth. So let that be my sanctified robe. Priest asked me what my religion was, and I told him I channeled John Coltrane and became a devout musician. I've always been a child of God. You don't believe me? Just ask my blessed beloved mom. But tell me, why do God's children have to experience every test? And exactly how much of a blessing comes with a financial offering? Well, consider the fact that all our damn deeds need to be sermonized, and somewhere deep in that sin darkness, there's always a crack of light. It ain't for sale, but nothing in this world is half price. And if you end up with, and what you end up with does not satisfy, nobody's giving you that money back. Can you see me in that light with the children of God? Those blues people with the hanks riding them hard. Please do tell all the other infidels that I believe the choruses falling out of the mouths of the raggedy people that I'm around are the actual utterances of saints.
Thank you, Gary. And I'll read the opening poem to Spirit Boxing. It's called John Henry, Sleeping in High Grass. Mowers miles away, mud flies on top his hammer like they own it, his chest cresting and falling in shapes, shifting between sunlight and leaves. Black steel his destiny. John is motion at rest, tides of moon and waves and still waters, suns igniting hearts of molten iron, a hardened conviction, rose petals and rain. Sleep is a dream, the real world a poundage, work a sentence for being his mama's son, the hammer in his crib, the supernatural a drum song of woodpeckers, cowbells in the field, heaven a home going back to a place before the bugle call to be born.
Afaa, Gary, thank you both.
Thank you.
It's an
Ma
honor.
Weaver, thank you.
And Sarah, appreciate you putting this on. Everybody, I think we should call the night. And what a
Thank
night
you,
it was. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah. Sarah, we good?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Afaa.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Thank you.